My name is Dr. Rich Scheibner. I'm an associate professor in the writing department. I'm pleased to say a few words and introduce today's visiting scholar and guest, Dr. Jason Tham. Before we begin, I want to offer a big thanks to the Digital Scholarship Librarian, Chris Joseph, MMCL manager, Sydney Daley, and the team of the Making and Media Creation Lab for their knowledge and technical prowess for collaborating on today's event. Let's give them a round of applause. Look at this place. It's awesome. And if you haven't checked out the lab and any of the resources, please do. It's amazing. I am on sabbatical this year, but the year before, the year prior, I would go and visit. I could do podcasting. I think I've even yelled in there with Chris a couple times. We've done like sound tests, and it's an amazing spot. So please check out the resources, including the VR materials that we'll be looking at today. I also want to thank the Faculty of Liberal Arts and Professional Studies for awarding us a collaborative seed grant to bring Dr. Tham and to the Association of Writing Across the Curriculum, or AWAC, for supporting our collaborative research with Drs. Beth Caramella and Sarah Riddick. And now I'd like to say a few words about today's visiting scholar, Dr. Jason Tham. So, great things can happen when you share tacos together. That's a fact, right? So that's what happened when Jason and I discussed a virtual reality project at a conference in 2023. It was a conference that led to several collaborative writing projects that we've been working on, including one this week, and then remotely. And it's a real pleasure to sort of see how that takes place. Conferences, networking, there's still such a power in that, whether you're in person or you're remote. We first met at the Conference on College Composition and Communication in 2017. I'm pretty sure that was when it was, around Kansas City. And I've been admiring his work since, including his food pictures on Instagram. So check those out. So Dr. Tham is an associate professor of technical communication and rhetoric at Texas Tech University on the indigenous land of Comanche and Mescalero Apache peoples. He works as an assistant chair in the Department of English and teaches courses in user experience, or UX, research, information design, instructional design, web publishing, and digital rhetoric. He also directs the UK UX Research Lab and serves as the faculty sponsor to the TTU Society for Technical Communication. Dr. Tham holds a PhD in rhetoric and scientific and technical communication from the University of Minnesota. During his time as a PhD student and early career researcher, Dr. Tham has investigated the socio-cultural aspects of wearable technologies and embodied devices to examine their applications in various learning contexts. So even yesterday, we were exploring what it's like to write in VR and the kind of impact that happens. So I was real pleased and just to find immense sort of gratification as a scholar collaborating with him on these projects, because he has this knowledge base he can bring to these projects. So for this work, he was inducted in 2019 as a research partner to the Digital Life Institute, an international research collective hosted at Ontario Tech University, so not far from us. In addition to publishing regularly with field journals, he has authored several books focused on the application of design thinking mindsets and collaborative learning in professional practice and writing pedagogy. So some of these books include UX Writing, which a colleague of mine was mentioning today as using in classes, Keywords in Design Thinking, the Collaborative Writing Playbook, and Design Thinking in Technical Communication. Dr. Tham is continually intrigued by the impact of technologies on our personal, professional, and social lives, and he strives to better understand how we might facilitate better living and learning through these technologies. He serves as a chief editor of Computers and Composition, premier journal in writing studies. And if you've taken classes with our faculty in the writing department, you've probably seen that journal a couple of times. It's one of our favorite. Outside of work, he enjoys working out, cooking, running, and parenting 2 affectionate cats and 2 attention-seeking doggos with his partner. Jason, welcome.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Rich. Thank you, all of you, for taking time out today to come attend this talk. I'm glad to be able to bring a crowd into the library and to showcase this space as well. So please do look around and thank the staff member for putting together this event for us today. I also want to point your attention to the flyer that was on your seat. So Rich mentioned we are still running a project to examine how writers or anyone who does writing, essentially, and how they experience drafting or brainstorming or sort of inventional activities within VR environment, and some of which I will kind of point to in the presentation today. But that's a call for participation, and I do want to invite you to consider exploring that experience with us. If you're interested, talk to myself or talk to Rich to sign up. We'll make time for you, and we're asking for 45 minutes to an hour of your time, and you get compensated for participating and get to experience what it's like to actually experience writing within an immersive environment. So those are information for your perusal. And also, after this talk, we're going to have some stations to your left. There will be some headsets will be available if you want to try out. Whether you are an experienced VR user or if you're a first-timer, we welcome you to come try out using a VR. We'll have an app loaded up for you to kind of experience that too. And you can take selfies. So, okay, well, thanks for the introduction. I don't want to spend too much time talking about myself, but I do want to show you a little bit where I'm coming from. So again, my name is Jason Tham, and I'm associate professor in the Department of English at Texas Tech University, and that's a bird eye or drone eye view of our entrance to the campus. Texas Tech has just celebrated its 100th year anniversary this last year. So, and I'm a faculty on the Technical Communication and Rhetoric program. So very similar to the writing department here, but we specialized specifically in technical writing, communication, information design areas. And personally, I'm really interested in emerging technologies. As you heard in introduction, ever since I was a graduate student, I was already kind of immersed in working with wearable technologies, RIP, Google Glass, but Fitbits are still around, your Apple Watches kind of predate some of those research projects, but those are things that I'm interested in. Embodiment is a keyword that you will hear me talk a lot about. That is how we physically interact with technologies, how it allows us to feel and think and be humans while using technology. So those are things I'm interested in. And user experience is an area in technical communication that focuses on studying how people behave, how people think and feel with technology. It has a set of methods that allows us to study those interactions, those attitudes, those behaviors. It's also a profession. So a lot of people work as user experience writers or researchers or designers. And if you're interested, talk to your faculty members. I'm sure they will tell you how to enter that career path. And in general, I'm just kind of sort of a self-proclaimed methods nerd as well. I edit a journal. Of course, I pay attention to all these kind of methodological processes and details in research studies. So in this particular talk, I will focus quite a bit on the methods part of using VR in research. So without further ado, I'm going to jump in here with the talk. I'm planning on reading quite a bit, so you see me look down, but I'll take Q&A questions at the end of the talk. So feel free to write down any thoughts you might have or questions that you want to ask regarding the presentation here. So to start, I would say that today we are at a unique intersection where technological innovation is changing not just how we live, how we work, how we play, but also how we do research. The rise of VR in this world right now is not just a technological trend, it is a rhetorical and social technical shifts that is changing the way we engage with knowledge production. What does it mean to do research inside a virtual environment? What new possibilities emerge when researchers interact with participants through avatars immersive spaces and embodied experiences rather than your traditional face-to-face or online exchanges. And equally important, what ethical, technological challenges are present in these environments? These are questions that I'd like to explore today. For many people, VR is still primarily associated with gaming and entertainment. We think of Oculus or now Meta headsets, or the whole metaverse hype, or immersive simulations. But VR is also increasingly making its way into education, professional training, and scientific research, as you will see. For many disciplines like engineering, medicine, and social sciences, they're adopting VR both as a research tool as well as an environment in which people interact with one another. But in technical and professional communication, which I would use as an umbrella reference to the field that is interested in writing and design, there has not been yet an established agenda for studying VR as a research site. Instead, most of the existing research focuses on VR as a tool for workplace training, like I mentioned earlier, or instructional design, or usability testing to see how people kind of react with those headsets. Very few studies have examined VR itself, functioning as a space for us to conduct research, where researchers could interact with participants, do ethnographies, observations, or analyze social dynamics. So that brings us to this gap. We know that VR can be used to test technologies. We know that VR can simulate real-world scenarios for learning, but we know far less about how researchers conduct research inside VR environments themselves and what that means for fields like ours, writing, rhetoric, communication, or other social technical studies. And this is precisely why I would like to discuss a study that has been published in an IEEE journal titled Researching with Virtual Reality, and I hope it makes a contribution to our conversation in the field. In that particular study, I followed a graduate scholar whose name, we use a pseudonym Kai to represent them. And Kai was conducting a master's thesis on identity formation and community building in social VR environments, so quite specific. And Kai was using ethnographic research methods inside VR. They interviewed participants in platforms like VR Chat and Horizon Worlds, two very popular social VR apps. They studied and explore how identity and social belongingness were constructed within these social spaces. They documented their research processes, and from what I was able to gather, they also revealed some unique methodological affordances and challenges in doing VR-based research. Some of the questions that they asked included, what does it mean to conduct interviews inside VR? How does embodiment affect researcher and participant dynamic? What sort of ethical considerations emerge when research is conducted in an immersive or interactive space rather than a traditional or in-person setting? So following that journey, Kai's journey, I offer practical and theoretical insights into the future of researching within these virtual environments. And for our talk today, I want to frame 3 questions that will guide our thinking. First, how can VR serve as a methodological space for social technical research? Second, what are the unique challenges of conducting research within VR? And third, how can technical communication scholars, rhetoric scholars, or even user experience scholars integrate VR with their research practices? And so I've organized this talk into 3 segments, starting with what I call the rhetorical dimensions, focusing on identity, persuasion, and issues of interaction. Second, it's the social technical dimensions, which will cover some of the affordances and challenges of using VR. And finally, technological dimensions, which will look at some of the more technical level opportunities and barriers pertaining to conducting VR. By the end of this talk, my hope is that you walk away with some new perspectives about VR, not just as a tool, but as a methodology that challenges our understanding of presence, interactivity, and knowledge production. Now that we have set that stage, let's begin with the rhetorical dimension. When we think about rhetoric, how many of you have heard of the term rhetoric? Okay, hopefully more than half of you in Dr. C's class, maybe. All right. We traditionally think of rhetoric in terms of language, persuasion, right, and communication. How we construct arguments, how we establish credibility, how audiences respond to different modes of communication or discourse. But in VR, I argue that rhetoric becomes something that is more than just words or discourse. It becomes embodied, spatial, and interactive. For example, in traditional research, an interview happens typically in a somewhat static environment. It could be a university office, a coffee shop, or even on a Zoom call. In VR, interviews happen in immersive, dynamic spaces. Some of it is created by users themselves. You can imagine a futuristic cityscape, or a floating island, a medieval castle, or even a virtual nightclub. And this shift fundamentally alters how researchers engage with participants and how participants construct or express their identities within the research space. And I'll cover 3 rhetorical concerns here, starting with ethos and virtual presence, and then followed by identity and representation, and third, the ethics level of VR research. Ethos, which is a central concept in rhetorical theory, traditionally refers to credibility, character, and the trustworthiness of a speaker or an author. What happens when ethos is mediated by, say, things like avatars, digital environments, and immersive interfaces? In Kai's study, they offered an illuminating perspective. As a graduate student researcher conducting interviews in VR chat and Horizon Worlds, Kai quickly realized that establishing trust and credibility was very different from establishing trust and credibility in a traditional qualitative research environment. In VR, participants didn't just hear Kai's voice or see their face on a Zoom call. They encountered Kai's digital avatar in a simulated space. And this meant that their first impression was shaped by how Kai's avatar looked, moved, or interacted within the VR environment. Instead of a professional outlook, an attire, or a tidy little office background on your Zoom, Kai's credibility was tied to their virtual embodiment, how they carried themselves in a digital mediated character. The way that avatar gestured, occupied space, and responded in real time all contributed to that level of credibility. And this is a shift from traditional setting. Think about it. What does it mean for ethos when your credibility is tied to not just what you say, but what your virtual self, your representation, does or perform in an artificial environment? Some participants hesitated to take an academic researcher seriously in a VR setting where they're used to socializing or just gaming. Others, on the other side, was more open and expressive precisely because the environment was far less formal than an academic interview. So this tension between credibility and informality in VR research reveals a core rhetorical challenge. As you can see here, how do researchers establish trust and authority in an immersive space where traditional credibility markers like body language or physical presence or professional settings are absent, or at least they're mediated, they're not real? Now let's consider identity and representation. One of the most striking aspects of VR is that users can craft and modify their digital identities, not just in the avatar forms, but they can change them at will. So at any time, you can just switch it up, change gender, change outfit, change how you look or move. So unlike in traditional research, where a participant's appearance is fixed, in VR, the participant can change the avatar to look like however they choose, human, non-human, realistic, or non-realistic. Kai studies highlighted several key implications of avatars itself for research interactions. Some participants chose hyper-realistic avatars, which sort of are like digital versions of themselves, suggesting that they wanted some authentic self-representation in the VR space. Others preferred completely fictional characters, right? Robots, aliens, or animal figures, which could signal playfulness or a desire for anonymity. And there are also some that change the avatars frequently, like I said, which complicates for a researcher the notion of a participant identity. So for us, the rhetorical questions are, how do researchers read body language and identity in VR? What does an avatar reveal or conceal about a person's identity? How does visual aesthetics of an avatar affects power dynamics between the researcher and the participants? I don't have answers to those questions, but those are for us to think about. Now, lastly, in this first segment on rhetoric, I want to talk about ethics. As VR increasingly becomes a site for social interaction, it also raises serious ethical consideration for researchers. In Kai's experience, they reviewed several ethical dilemmas that are unique to VR-based research. Let's see. Okay. First, informed consent in virtual spaces. Unlike a traditional study, we still ask participants to give us verbal and sometimes written consent for in a research setting, but unlike a traditional setting where these consent process could happen in a more structured way, VR participants are fluid and they come in and out. They can drop in, drop out of conversation at any time. So it makes it difficult to ensure that participants fully understand or agree to the research conditions before engaging with the researcher, say for an interview. Should researcher require a pre-screening process, or should consent be built into the VR experience itself? Second, on data privacy and security. In traditional research, confidentiality is typically managed through secure databases or secure data protection management practices, as well as anonymized transcripts. In VR, conversation could be recorded, streamed, or stored in a third-party platforms without the participant even fully realizing it. So what happens when VR companies have access to participant data? How do we protect participants' identities in a space that is both public and interactive? And third, ethical challenges of navigating toxic or unsafe VR spaces. And this is particularly important for Kai because they were studying queer identity constructions within VR. In their research, they encountered instances of harassment, trolling, and other toxic behaviors, issues that are quite common, unfortunately, in gaming and social VR environments. So this raises important questions for us as technical researchers. Should we intervene when we witness problematic behaviors? The answer is yes. How do we protect participants from harm in unpredictable virtual spaces? Should VR research be controlled only in a lab sort of environment, or to avoid all these ethical risks? So these concerns all highlight that VR is not just an extension of traditional research. It requires an entirely new ethical framework that accounts for anonymity and digital embodiment. Let's move on now to our second segment on sociotechnical dimension. When we talk about sociotechnical research, I'm referring to the interplay between technology and social behavior, And this means considering how people interact with technology, how technology shapes our social experiences, and how research methods need to adapt to these social digital environments. In Kai's research, they provided an example of how VR could extend the reach and interactivity of social technical research. In their study, they were able to enter VR chat or horizon worlds and observe how people formed communities, particularly queer communities, how they interacted or expressed their identities. But unlike in a traditional interview or ethnography where participants describe their experiences in person, Kai participants actually show them around the VR environments. They show them, here's how I made, here's what I created, here's a room full of people like me. And they demonstrated behaviors or even modified the avatars to show the researcher, here's what it's like to be me in this space. Imagine conducting an interview inside a VR cityscape where the participants can move through different environments, pointing out different social hotspots, and even demonstrate how to interact with others. And this makes VR a richer research space than traditional tools like your Zoom calls or even just traditionally mediated online interaction. But of course, with these affordances come challenges, especially when it comes to finding participants, collecting data, and ensuring the validity of research. First, accessibility to participants. That means gaining access to them, getting to actually invite them to participate in a research. It's a difficult, challenging, and sometimes unpredictable process in VR. These platforms are open and fluid, like I said, meaning that participants can enter or leave at any time. And in spaces like VR chat or Horizon World or Rec Room specifically, attract younger users, which means it makes it hard for a researcher to screen for participants over 18 years old as a requirement for, say, like institutional research board. Many users are also anonymous, making it really hard to ensure that demographic representations is true and that the research participant sample pool is valid. So for researchers, we ask, how do we ensure rigorous participant selection in VR environments that are inherently fluid or anonymous? Another constraint here, perhaps one of the bigger ones, to barrier in conducting VR research is accessibility. And now I'm talking about the technical side, not just gaining access to people. First, these headsets are expensive, and you get to try them later. Devices like the MetaQuest HTC Vive could range from $400 to $1,500, making them quite inaccessible to many users. And then there's this digital literacy divide. Some users are highly skilled in VR interaction, others struggle to navigate with the space. You can ask Rich about his experience onboarding some users who are confused or frustrated about learning how to use the controls. And so this affected how researchers conduct their studies. Another challenge in VR is navigating that social norm that I mentioned, sometimes referred to as the toxic culture. So there are high levels, as Kai has mentioned in their study, high levels of trolling, harassment, and inappropriate behaviors. And this means that as researchers, we need to moderate conversations. We need to protect participants from harmful interactions. There are also these, and this is quite specific to Kai's research, there's also this like echo chamber effect where like-minded users gather in VR spaces. So it creates bias in VR communities. They form all these tight-knit communities that reinforces specific social norms. So you sometimes hear insider language that are used within these communities that as a researcher, if you're new to the environment, you would not know what is being referred to, okay? For example, this is off script. I know that Kai plays a game that is a zero gravity frisbee game, and in there they use the term Chicago to represent like a self blocking or self goal mechanism. Anyway, so that's an example of like a lingo that is used within a particular app that a researcher like myself entering that space would have no idea what Chicago means. Anyway, so there's strong in-group behaviors which could affect how openly or unopenly participants respond to researchers. And lastly, our third dimension on technological aspects. Technology, as we know, is both an enabler and a barrier to research. On one hand, advancements in VR hardware and software have opened entirely new methods for us to conduct research, from immersive ethnographies to interactive user studies. On the other hand, technical limitations like cost, accessibility, or even discomfort when using the device, and data security can restrict who participates in VR research and who is being excluded. So very quickly, I want to chat about some affordances first, some benefits. So one key benefit is immersion, as you would expect, that VR allows a deep engagement with research topics through simulation, right? You can experience it in a simulated made-up world or entirely fictional environments. So for example, instead of asking a participant how they experience a community, they can show you, they can invite you into a group, you can join them inside those spaces and observe interactions from within, from a first-hand point of view. For interactivity, unlike traditional research where participants describe those behaviors to you, you can ask them to demonstrate it, show it to me, right? How you embody your avatar or yourself in an activity inside VR. And finally, co-presence, which touches on the sense of shared space, making it more natural and engaging for researchers to conduct things like interviews or even quasi-experiments. So in Kai's research, the VR chat at Horizon Worlds showed participants were more expressive and comfortable in VR than traditional interviews, because they also did like, outside of VR, they also did online interview just to debrief on what happened from the VR experience. They realized that they were less expressive once they come out of that VR space. They were less talkative, they were less interactive when they're just on a screen. And that was an interesting phenomenon. I think because they were more socially present when they are inside an immersive environment. Now, what about limitations? I already touched on some cost-related concerns. The headsets are expensive, we know that. So for many participants, they cannot afford VR hardware, which then excludes lower-income population from VR studies, again, skewing our research samples and our population. Second has to do with discomfort or usability issues. VR can cause physical discomfort, although we have come a long way since motion sickness or just a feeling of nausea. But those are now slowly stabilized, but still some people can experience that discomfort when they're inside a simulation. So again, that could exclude certain users. And finally, with data ownership issues, who owns VR data? Because they often take place, our research often take place in corporate-owned platforms like Meta and applications like VR Chat and Rec Room. So that raises serious privacy issues. I mentioned earlier that these companies also collect user data. They track what people are doing within the spaces, so meaning they have access to researchers' information as well. So they might be subject to these third-party control on data. So as an implication, VR researchers need to develop new guidelines for ensuring data security, informed consent, and participant privacy in those settings. Now, all this is to say we're pretty close to the end here now. We are at a turning point where VR is no longer just a futuristic novelty. It is a research space that is already influencing many industries, including education, as well as writing and technical communication practices. So the question now is no longer if VR will be a part of research, but rather how we will integrate it ethically, effectively, and inclusively. And with these exciting new possibilities, I ask, how do we ensure that VR research is responsible and equitable? So one of the earlier things I mentioned was the digital divide, right? With users having different literacy level, different access, the cost dimension of VR headset, that's probably one of the biggest hurdle that we have to address. So I want to ask us as different kinds of stakeholders, if you will, in this process, what are some of the roles that we could play in addressing these challenges? So let's start with faculty and researchers. We need to expand our agendas to include VR-based methodologies. That means to our training with, say, graduate students or emerging scholars. We need to push for institutional support for VR labs, for funding, for ethical review processes for the very concerns that I had earlier. We need to collaborate across disciplines, bringing together communication, rhetoric, design, computer science, social sciences to develop stronger VR research framework. For students and other emerging scholars or researchers, we could experiment with VR as a space for pilot studies, preferably using free or low-cost VR platforms. We could engage in interdisciplinary conversations, bringing together all these disciplines that I mentioned earlier, including user experience and perhaps even technology, psychology, communication. Consider VR's implication for your own work. I know there are some students here who are in Dr. C's class, right? You're perhaps working on some storytelling, right, activity. Think about how narrative flows, for example, in VR. How does identity impact the way people carry themselves or express themselves in immersive environment? And finally, for institutions or policymakers, I don't know if you have any administrators among us, I call for us to develop formal ethical guidelines for VR research, but more importantly, support this sort of research. Help us to gain access to VR technologies so we can diversify and be inclusive in our access or working with participants. Invest in long-term initiatives that explore how these technologies are shaping the way we communicate, the way we work, the way we educate, the way we produce knowledge. So to conclude, VR is not just a tool, it's a new methodological space that challenges the way we understand identity, credibility, presence, how we collect data, how we analyze them, how we interpret them, how we make sure that they are kept safe, how we engage with research participants in ways that are immersive, embodied. So the future of research, I think, is not just about studying VR, it's about researching with VR. So if you're interested in that particular study that I've just covered in this presentation, that's the QR code that will take you to the full PDF of the published article, as well as the following link takes you to the same PDF as well. So with that, I thank you for your attention and thank you for coming today. We'll open it for Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you, Jason. So we have about 15 minutes for questions, and then we'll flip over to doing some VR demonstrations if folks are interested. But yeah, we'll I'll moderate. Please go ahead.
Wonderful thought. You mentioned it a couple of times, but I was curious about in your research how you compensate or account for different levels of digital literacy when doing research with VR, or what does that process actually look like in practice?
So the question was, how do I compensate or account for different level of literacy when I'm using technologies such as VR to do research? And that's a great question. That means you're paying attention, right, to the digital divide, the question on different literacy level. I think what I usually do is I tell people that they do not need to have a particular level of literacy to participate. So you try to lower the threshold, right? So that more people can feel like they can come in and even just learn about what is it that you're doing. And you try to cater to different levels by allowing different kinds of activities to take place. So let's say for a non-user, somebody who has never used a VR headset before, for instance, you can just have them, try wearing it for the first time and tell you what they feel. What is it that they're seeing? What is it that they are experiencing? And that in itself could be documented, right? And of course, with other technologies as well, besides VR, right? Anything that's novel, typically people have like a pretty good, like strong first impression of it. So you could document those, but also if they have a higher level, if they have used. So in our study, for example, we actually do ask them on a scale of 1 to 5, tell us how experienced you think you are with this particular technology, right? And then they tell us, it gives us a good sense of where they're at. And then we try to use certain language that would then match that level of literacy. So if we know that you know the controller, for example, their names for the different parts, the trigger, the pointer and things like that, we can then use that to kind of reference those parts in a more natural way rather than telling them, think of it like holding a water gun, or like how you select something by pointing and triggering, right? Things like that. We tell them what button to push, so depending on that literacy level, we can then adjust our language with the participant. But to your question about like how do we make sure that we can diversify and make sure more people can participate, we just try to lower that threshold as much as possible.
Thank you. Additional questions? Yes,
I've got a couple, but the students should be able to ask. I'm just kind of, I can read it in the paper, but I was wondering if you could maybe talk us through about what literature you're situating yourself in, because some of my students are here and they're all about academic lineage and what are you engaging with and what are you not engaging with. So I see a lot of, I'm from game studies, so I see a lot of stuff with your old colleague, Jimmy Banks, her work on avatars, but just who's if we're excited about this, who should we go read? Who do you kind of engage with in literature?
Okay, yeah, sure. So the question was about academic lineage and who do I cite essentially, right? Who do I use kind of build upon my scholarship and who reference my community? Yeah. So for me, because I come from the technical communication and rhetoric domain, so we have this area, a sub-area called digital rhetoric, which is interested in all things interactivity and how technologies help mediate the rhetorical process, and in itself it's pretty big, talking about persuasion, building expertise, credibility, things like that. So I usually draw from digital rhetoric as my primary community, but also this work actually is published in an engineering journal. IEEE is an engineering journal, but focusing on professional communication, training and education. So I also build it upon how do we train students to be better communicators and writers through the use of technology, right? So writing with technology, writing for technology, writing against technology, right? Some of those things are things that have been published in those domains that I draw from communication scholars, but there's a lot of tech comm people who are truly interested in technology because they're so innate in the way we do our work. So, thank you.
We referenced the limitation in participant biases due to financial and just advance these technologies. Have you noticed any issues with like racial and cultural backgrounds, specific minority communities that aren't really in the representation?
Okay. Yeah. So the question was about biases and perhaps some cultural, racial differences in the makeup of the people who are in these environments. The quick answer is yes, but I don't have actual empirical data to prove that. Simply just from anecdotal, observational perspective, I can tell you, yeah, a lot of people who are already into gaming, for example, is like a primary group, like people who are very much available to us. They're on there pretty frequently. They're not your first timer or people who are just exploring. And within the gaming community, you can kind of imagine people who are very dedicated to their crafts and games and entertainment. All right. I go in as a non-gamer actually. I always hold my hands up when I walk in. I come in peace. But I like to see like how people react to people like me actually, like how they introduce me to their community. They like to show me around. That's like one of the first thing I notice is that they're very welcoming. All of these people, whether they come from here or here referring to North America or other places, they like to build virtual like spaces that are made up. So one example I have shared with my colleagues was like, if you know Studio Ghibli, they're in like made up sort of stories. I've been in a Horizon made up world where somebody recreated, so think like Minecraft 3.0, right? Like physical, actual castle, the house moving castle that you can actually walk in and experience all these rooms and things like that. So that's actually quite fun. And they like to show me around. I was shown around the castle by like a gamer. So, but that's your like sort of most immediate and most available primary group of users within there, the gamers.
Is there questions in the back? Yeah.
Yes.
Please go ahead.
Hi, thank you so much for your informative talk. As someone who tends to get dizzy on roller coasters and movie movies, when we talked about how people experience nausea and dizziness wearing those virtual headsets, do you know what causes that and what has been done to alleviate that?
Mm-hmm. So the question was on discomfort when the users who are wearing them feel nausea or dizziness, motion sickness. That's because the fast-moving kind of visual, right, that we're not used to. Instead of seeing it on a screen, now you're seeing it literally right in front of your eye. You're like, it's a surround visual. So it tricks your brain into thinking that you are actually following that motion, right? The roller coaster kind of experience, which is pretty common on boarding VR application. So I don't exactly know what the medical terms are that causes that,
It's the closest thing that you could relate it to, I guess, would be car sickness. It's the fact that images are moving past moving in your eyes, but your ears are stationary.
So the equilibrium kind of.
Yeah, so equilibrium.
You're right. Yeah. So thank you. So typically we ask, the more time you spend in it, the brain adjusts to it. So then you become more comfortable over time. But that immediate impression could be overwhelming for a lot of people. But I think what has been done to mitigate that is that a lot of these headsets now have like mini like stabilizers, if you will. Like if you go on a cruise now these days, they have like giant stabilizers for the cruise, so that you don't feel like motion sickness when you're on there. It's like similar kind of technology within the thing that makes you feel less like shaky. The images are less shaky.
Yeah, you mentioned that they range from around 400 to around 1500, right? I know that the space is rapidly growing, right? Is there anything that we can do, because we did mention that it's not always available for everybody, right? It is a little bit on the pricier side. Is there anything that this space plans on doing to make it more accessible for everybody long term?
Mm-hmm.
Or is there anything else that
Yeah, that's an excellent question. So the question was on cost. and accessibility. So yeah, in fact, you can even go higher than the 1500 price point, right? Some more advanced, like if you think Apple Vision Pro at $3,000, right? Or more, depending on the storage size. How do we make it more accessible to people who don't have money to buy it for themselves, right? We rely on spaces like institutions who might be able to invest in some of these devices and I know them that they have done it here. You can check them out, right? If you just want to experiment or if you want to do research with them. Sorry, I'm speaking on behalf of the staff. I'm sure you have some policies on that. But as long as I think you're doing it, for professional scholarly purposes, right? You can check them out and use them and experience them for yourself without having to buy one on your own. Do we still have time?
Yeah, perhaps one more?
Okay.
Yeah.
One last question, make it a really, really good one. Now nobody will ask. Well, let me ask you, how would you use, so if I say now, you get a VR, you get a VR, you get a VR, what would you use it for?
Yes, scientific education demonstration. I work with the chemistry department on this record where they use a VR space to demonstrate the molecules to the students. So
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's very cool. I mean, that's fantastic, right? That's what we hope we all could do, right? If I could dissect like inside the human body, if I could show you, walk you through, or whatever, right? Yeah.
Video game.
Video games. Yeah.
There's an inherent connection between storytelling and politics, especially dystopian works. So I think it'd be really interesting if like you drew into crazy situations like that, just for the study, like physical reactions.
Right. I love that. Yeah. There are actually quite a bit of apps out there that are simply just story narrative, kind of like experiential. They're not meant to. You don't have to achieve any kind of goal. You're just in there to immerse yourself. For example, this one that I spent some time on during Christmas was simply going on like a ride with like the reindeers, right? Flying over like buildings and all. That has no goals. It's just a ride, and it's easy, and you get like Christmas song playing in the back, and you get to see, the sky and the lights and all. But those kind of like immersive, like story narrative experience, I think that's a great use for that sort of technology. Yeah. Yes.
On set to replace screens, so that potentially having VR instead, just sit on my desk and instead of having my wide screen, I'll just have 5 of them and still be able to use my hand.
Yeah, I think Apple should hire you as their spokesperson because that's what they're trying to do with the Vision Pro and AR, right? So there are a lot of crossover now between the different kinds of realities, right? But yes, a screen replacement perhaps. So I think that's a great point for us to end the Q&A. Thank you again for everything. Yeah.
And Jason, I learned that you are very much a coffee person.
Yes.
Got to see all that, so we will get for you.
Yes, thank you.
Yes. And now I think we'll turn to doing. We have time to experiment with some of the VR headsets. Again, thanks to the staff at the MMCL, we have thought about Open Brush as one thing that you could test especially because the stuff that we've been doing as researchers lately is on writing and sort of annotations and things like that you could do in VR. So if you want to see what it's like to write in the air, and things of that sort, want to test those applications, or just simply put it on and see what that experience is like, feel free to check it out. It'll be right here, correct? Yes. All right, nice.